The ward smelled of iodine and iron, like a wound that would not stop telling its story. A young private sat on a cot, fingers trembling around a tin cup, his eyes fixed on a corner of the ceiling where dust moved like distant snow. His uniform was streaked with mud and something darker, a map of the things war had done to him. He flinched at the sudden clatter of boots, the way someone flinches at thunder. They called it shell shock then. Later, a kinder tongue would name it PTSD, a phrase that folded the terrible arithmetic of terror into clinical neatness. In that moment, the name did nothing to still his shaking hands. Enter General George S. Patton, a silhouette in boot leather and brass, a man whose arrival rearranged the air like a command. He had thunder in his stride and a conviction that the world rewarded speed and scorn for softness. To his admirers, he was grace under fire incarnate. Aggressive, brilliant, the sort of commander who made victory look inevitable. To others, he was a man for whom nuance was a nuisance and mercy an indulgence. He believed, with an almost theological fervor, that weakness was contagious and that a strong slap of will could immunize an army. What happened in that ward was quick enough to be a scandal and slow enough to feel faded. A hand, not a report, not a reprimand, but a backhand that split reverence and horror in one sound, landed across a soldier's cheek. The private reeled, not from pain so much as from a betrayal of expectation, that those who wore the nation's uniform would be shielded, not struck. Patton's face did not register irony, it registered a single-minded calculus. If fear could be beaten out of a man, then the army would be stronger for it. That slap echoed farther than the ward. It entered newspapers and cable rooms, into the careful chambers where reputations are minted and unmade. It raised a question that still resonates. When does boldness cross into brutality? When does the virtue of decisive command calcify into a cruelty that leaves moral casualties long after the armistice? The story of George S. Patton isn't just about a general who slapped a soldier. It's about the moment when America's myth of invincible courage cracked, revealing the fragile, frightened humanity inside the machine of war. Patton embodied the paradox of the 20th century warrior, a man who could win battles but not always win himself. He believed the enemy was cowardice, whether in the German line or in a trembling American private. Yet that belief exposed something deeper, the uneasy truth that modern warfare doesn't only demand bravery, it demands empathy, too. The incident in Sicily became a mirror for America's conscience. Could victory justify humiliation? Could discipline excuse dehumanization? Patton's slap wasn't just an act of violence. It was a moral explosion, a small detonation that forced generals, politicians, and the public to decide what kind of nation they wanted to be when the smoke cleared. In the end, the world would remember Patton for his genius on the battlefield, but it would never forget the sound of that slap. Because in that instant, George S. Patton stopped being just a hero of war. He became a symbol of the line between strength and cruelty. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family that worshipped the mythology of war. His ancestors had fought in the Civil War and even the Revolution, and dinner conversations were less about table manners than about valor, honor, and the fate of nations. Young George grew up in a house filled with swords, portraits of ancestors in gray uniforms, and stories where hesitation was the cardinal sin. From the very beginning, he learned that glory had a uniform and mercy rarely made history. He was an intelligent boy, but not effortlessly so. Dyslexia made reading a torment, and words often betrayed him. Yet he compensated with the kind of willpower that could bend metal, memorizing, repeating, grinding his way through West Point, where he wore discipline like armor. He wasn't merely trying to succeed, he was trying to prove he was born for greatness. At West Point, Patton studied cavalry tactics as if they were scripture. He admired medieval knights, quoting them as though they were mentors. War, to him, was not just politics by other means. It was theater, destiny, even art. That romanticism hardened into obsession during World War I when he led America's first tank corps. The smell of oil and fire thrilled him. He called his tanks chariots of God. The machine and the man merged, both fast, merciless, unstoppable. But beneath the steel was a man haunted by inadequacy. Every hesitation, every loss, every weakness, whether his or others, felt like a personal betrayal. To be human was, in Patton's eyes, to risk being fragile. And fragility disgusted him. That's what made him great. and what doomed him. By the time World War II began, Patton had turned his insecurity into spectacle. He crafted himself into a myth: pearl-handled pistols, polished boots, a voice like a whip crack. Soldiers either worshipped him or feared him, often both. He preached discipline like gospel, believing that courage was a choice and fear a moral failure. But every myth needs friction, and Patton's was no exception. The same fire that made him a conqueror of deserts and cities would soon turn inward, burning through the thin veneer that separated genius from cruelty. In Sicily, 1943, that fire would find its fuel. By 1942, the deserts of North Africa had become Patton's personal stage. Where others saw dust and despair, he saw destiny. The U.S. Army had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass, and morale was sinking faster than the setting sun over Tunisia. Into that chaos rode Patton, a cavalryman turned mechanized messiah, to rebuild what had fallen apart. He stormed into headquarters like a general from another century, demanding polished boots, pressed uniforms, and obedience that bordered on worship. To the men, he was both savior and tyrant. To Washington, he was the man who could make the army believe in itself again. Patton's genius wasn't just tactical, it was political. He understood the theater of leadership. Cameras loved him. His profanity-laced speeches became legend. His swagger, spectacle. He cultivated an image that made even Eisenhower, his superior and his opposite, both admire and fear him. Eisenhower's charm and diplomacy balanced Patton's volatility, and their uneasy alliance became one of World War II's strangest dualities. The calm strategist paired with the holy warrior. Patton, of course, thrived on enemies, both foreign and domestic. He saw British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery as a rival and often mocked him in private, calling him a paper soldier with perfect hair. The two men would later race each other across Europe, their egos nearly as explosive as their tanks. But within the American command structure, Patton's greatest rival was patience itself. Eisenhower's political instincts often clashed with Patton's raw intensity. Where Ike saw optics and alliances, Patton saw only the next hill to take, the next town to liberate. Behind the scenes, Patton's rise was a product of more than bravado. His connections, old family friends in the War Department, senior officers from West Point, and even Roosevelt staffers who admired his results, kept him afloat when his temper nearly sank him. The Army needed heroes, and Patton fit the part too perfectly to discard. When Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, began in 1943, Patton was finally unleashed. His orders were clear: move fast, hit hard, and outshine Montgomery's British Eighth Army. He did all three. Within weeks, American forces swept across the island like a storm, taking Palermo, then Messina. Newspapers called him America's fastest general. Patton basked in the glow of victory, medals gleaming, journalists flocking, his legend growing louder with each photograph. But power has gravity. It pulls at the flaws beneath the medals, the doubts beneath the rhetoric. And as Patton's fame expanded, so did his sense of infallibility. He began to mistake fear for respect, cruelty for discipline, and the human cost of war for an acceptable exchange rate. Then, in a sweltering field hospital near Nicosia, that illusion shattered with the sound of a single slap. It was August 3rd, 1943. Sicily was suffocating under heat and flies. Inside a U.S. Army field hospital, the air hung heavy with morphine and whispered prayers. The nurses moved like ghosts between cots, tending to the broken, the burned, and the half-alive. In one corner sat Private Charles H. Cool, 20-year-old farm boy from Indiana, his nerves shot, his body intact, but his mind detonated. The doctors called it battle fatigue. His eyes had seen too much, his courage had simply collapsed under the weight. Then the canvas flap of the tent snapped open. General George S. Patton entered, boots polished, chin high, his pistol handles gleaming ivory. To the soldiers, his presence was a mixture of fear and faith. Patton didn't just command armies, he commanded belief. But that morning, belief took a cruel form. Patton approached Cool's cot. "What's the matter with you?" he demanded. "Sir, I guess I just can't take it anymore," the boy whispered. That sentence was the wrong one to say to George S. Patton. His face turned crimson. To him, can't was treason, weakness was contagion. In an instant, Patton's gloved hand struck the young man across the face. The slap cracked like a rifle shot through the tent. Cool fell back stunned. "You're a goddamn coward," Patton barked, his voice echoing off metal bed frames. He ordered the MPs to throw the boy out and send him back to the front. The hospital froze. The silence afterward was not obedience, it was disbelief. Nurses stood rigid. One doctor clenched his jaw. Someone scribbled the incident into the daily report, as if afraid it might vanish into rumor. But it didn't vanish. A week later, it happened again. This time with another soldier suffering the same invisible wounds. Again the slap. Again the words, "Coward, get out." Two isolated incidents became one story, and one story became scandal. Word reached Eisenhower's headquarters through military physicians, horrified by what they'd witnessed. Ike was no stranger to Patton's temper, but this was different. It wasn't just bad press. It was a breach of command ethics, a wound to the Army's moral authority. Eisenhower faced a political landmine. Punish Patton and risk morale, or protect him and risk public outrage. The American press soon caught wind. War correspondents whispered about the slap heard across Sicily. Time magazine hinted at disciplinary issues among senior officers. By November, the story broke wide open. The New York Times called it an act unbecoming of a general officer. Letters flooded the War Department, some demanding Patton's court-martial, others begging to keep him in command. The general himself, unrepentant at first, wrote in his diary, "I struck him deliberately. Real men don't shake." But Eisenhower, under pressure from Washington, ordered him to apologize publicly. It was the single most humiliating act of Patton's life. Before hundreds of troops, he swallowed his pride and said the words he never believed, "I was wrong." For the soldiers who adored him, it was confusing. The man who taught them to fear nothing was suddenly on his knees before bureaucracy. For the generals who distrusted him, it was satisfying. For Patton, it was worse than punishment. It was silence. He remained in command, but his star dimmed. The slap that was meant to restore courage had instead exposed his own weakness. Years later, when asked about the incident, Eisenhower said quietly, "George never understood that war tests the soul as much as the body." Patton won his campaigns, but in that tent, surrounded by broken boys and the ghosts of his own ideals, he lost the war within himself. In the aftermath of the Sicily incident, the U.S. Army found itself at a crossroads that extended far beyond one man's temper. The slap forced a brutal question into the open. What exactly did it mean to be fit for combat? Until then, the military's doctrine treated fear as failure and trauma as shame. A soldier's wounds had to be visible, blood, bone, or bullet, for them to count as real. Anything else was weakness. Patton embodied that ethos perfectly. His worldview came from an age that equated pain with purification and discipline with divinity. To him, a slap was therapy by violence, a crude but honest cure for cowardice. But modern warfare was evolving faster than old beliefs could keep up. The battlefield of Sicily, littered with burnt tanks and shattered nerves, showed that war no longer broke men's bodies alone. It broke their minds in ways the Army barely understood. Eisenhower, ever the political surgeon, recognized the danger. He knew that firing Patton would turn him into a martyr, and keeping him could turn him into a liability. So he performed a delicate operation. Patton would apologize, be quietly sidelined from command, and then slowly rehabilitated when public fury cooled. It was damage control disguised as discipline, and it worked. Yet behind the closed doors of military hospitals, doctors began using a new term with hushed reverence: combat exhaustion. It was less accusatory, more clinical. The shift in vocabulary was small but revolutionary, a seed that would grow into the modern concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Ironically, the general who denied psychological pain had forced his army to acknowledge it. Politically, the incident tested Roosevelt's wartime calculus. The president valued Patton's results. He got things done, quickly and violently, but America couldn't afford to look like the enemy it was fighting. "We must win," Roosevelt told advisors, "but we must remain human while doing so." The slap, in his mind, was more than a scandal. It was a symptom of the disease of total war, the way it corrodes empathy, turning heroes into instruments. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the British watched the scandal with both fascination and irony. Field Marshal Montgomery privately smirked. Churchill, however, saw through the noise. "Patton," he said, "is our most magnificent barbarian. God grant us more of his kind and fewer of his moments." In the long view of history, that balance, brilliance and brutality, became the Patton paradox. He won battles that helped end fascism, yet also exposed the cruelty woven into victory itself. His slap didn't just sting a soldier's face, it slapped awake an entire generation of officers who would never again dismiss the invisible wounds of war. And for all his medals, his triumphs, and his tanks, that may have been his greatest unintended legacy. When the story broke in late 1943, it ignited like a grenade in the American press. The slapping incidents, plural now, as the military admitted there were two, dominated headlines from the New York Times to the Chicago Tribune. The home front, weary of telegrams beginning with, "We regret to inform you," was suddenly forced to confront a moral riddle. What kind of hero strikes the wounded? Public outrage flared. Mothers of soldiers wrote to the War Department demanding Patton's dismissal. Veterans groups called the act a stain on the uniform. Members of Congress began whispering about inquiries. Yet among the ranks, the reaction was more complicated. Many frontline soldiers still adored Patton. "He made us believe we could win," one sergeant later told Stars and Stripes. "We didn't like what he did, but we needed men like him." Eisenhower worked tirelessly behind the scenes to contain the explosion. He knew Patton's temperament, brilliant but combustible, and understood that humiliation, not punishment, would be the sharper sword. He forced Patton to apologize, then quietly removed him from command of the next invasion, Operation Overlord. Instead, Omar Bradley, measured, patient, safe, took his place. To Patton, the reassignment was worse than exile. He called it being put on the shelf. In his diary, the bitterness bled through every word. "I have lived by the sword, and apparently I shall die by the pen." His peers watched with mixed satisfaction. Some generals saw justice served, others hypocrisy preserved. The army that preached compassion had simply hidden its barbarism under bureaucracy. They needed a scapegoat, one aide later recalled, and George was convenient. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's administration struggled to keep the scandal from damaging public morale. In speeches and press briefings, officials painted Patton as a man of passion, sometimes too great for his own good. It was a subtle dance: condemn the act, preserve the myth. Yet the myth was wounded. Patton's name became shorthand for the arrogance of power. He would return to command and to glory in the Battle of the Bulge. But the slap followed him like an echo that no victory could silence. It lingered in every photograph, every speech, every medal pinned to his chest. Because by then, America had stopped asking whether Patton could win wars and started asking whether men like him should be allowed to fight them. History has a habit of forgiving brilliance, especially when it comes wrapped in medals. By 1945, Patton had redeemed himself in the eyes of many Americans through his lightning campaign across France and his defiance during the Battle of the Bulge. Reporters once again called him a hero, a modern Caesar in olive drab. But beneath the triumphal headlines, the shadow of that Sicilian tent still stretched long and dark. The slap never vanished. It merely retreated behind the roar of victory. In post-war America, Patton's image became a riddle wrapped in contradiction. Hollywood turned him into an icon of iron-willed leadership. George C. Scott's portrayal in the 1970 film Patton immortalized him as the archetype of the unapologetic warrior. Yet even in that cinematic grandeur, the moral fissure remained visible. Was he a prophet of courage or a relic of cruelty? Among military historians, opinions split like battle lines. Some argued that Patton's brutality was the necessary cost of greatness, that his unforgiving standard forged armies capable of crushing tyranny. Others countered that his philosophy betrayed the very principles America claimed to fight for. He became both legend and lesson, a warning about what happens when victory becomes a god and compassion its first casualty. The psychological aftershocks of his outburst rippled through decades. The Army, now haunted by the ghosts of battle fatigue, began training doctors and officers to recognize trauma not as cowardice, but as consequence. By the time Vietnam arrived, shell shock had evolved into post-traumatic stress disorder, a term born from the wreckage Patton's slap helped expose. Even his enemies admired him. The German general Hermann Bauch once said, "Patton was the only American general truly feared by the Wehrmacht." Fear, it seemed, was both his weapon and his curse. Today, Patton's name lives on in military academies, strategy lectures, and motivational speeches. But the question that defined him still lingers like a moral drumbeat. Can a man be both a hero and a warning at once? For George S. Patton, the answer is yes, and history's verdict remains as conflicted as the man himself. In the end, George S. Patton died not on a battlefield, but on a quiet German road, his car crushed in an accident that felt more like irony than fate. The man who survived bullets, bombs, and scandal was undone by stillness. His body was broken, but his myth endured, polished, rewritten, and repackaged into the pantheon of American heroes. Yet beneath that marble facade remains a truth that refuses to fade. Patton's war was never just against Hitler's armies. It was against human frailty, the trembling, tear-streaked faces of the soldiers he could not understand. He waged war on weakness because he feared it in himself. Every slap, every curse, every act of defiance was a way of keeping his own fear at bay. That is what makes his story timeless and tragic. Patton personified the razor's edge of leadership, decisive enough to win, but too blind to see the humanity that victory demands. His legacy isn't measured only in miles conquered, but in the questions he left behind. Was he a hero who pushed men beyond their limits, or a cautionary tale about the cost of pushing too far? Perhaps both. Because in George S. Patton, we glimpse the uncomfortable truth about greatness. It's often forged in the same fire that burns compassion away. And so, when history asks whether courage and cruelty can coexist, it doesn't look to philosophers for answers. It looks to that Sicilian tent, to the echo of one slap, and to the man who believed he was saving his army when in truth, he was losing his soul.